Every Saturday morning, Michael Torres taught his nephew how to tie fishing knots on the back porch, patient fingers guiding smaller ones through the loops and twists. In August 1987, the 34-year-old construction foreman disappeared after leaving a county fair in Kalispell, Montana. He left behind a tackle box organized with meticulous care, a nephew who never learned the final knot, and a sister whose Saturday mornings became a weekly reminder of absence. For 36 years, Michael's sister Rita kept his fishing vest hanging by her back door, the pockets still holding his lucky lure and a pack of spearmint gum. Then, in 2023, a genealogist working with law enforcement traced DNA from a rural grave to a family tree that included Michael Torres. What the family would learn about someone who'd stood beside them at Michael's candlelight vigil, who'd helped search the woods, who'd brought casseroles and condolences, would rewrite every memory of that terrible summer. This is a story about how trust can become a weapon, how communities hold their missing close even as decades pass, and how sometimes the person offering comfort is the one who created the need for it. It's about the investigators who refuse to let the forgotten stay forgotten, and the families who carry hope like a stone in their pocket, smooth and heavy and essential. Michael Torres was the kind of man who remembered everyone's coffee order. At the construction sites where he worked as foreman, he'd show up Monday mornings with a cardboard tray, everyone's name written in his careful block letters on each cup. Extra shot for Danny, decaf for old Pete, cream and 2 sugars for the new kid whose name he'd learned on day 1. His crew loved him for it, these small acts of seeing people, of remembering what mattered to them. He grew up in Kalispell, Montana, where the mountains held the sky and everyone knew everyone, the way small towns do. Michael was the older brother, the one Rita looked up to, the one who'd walked her to school every day until she was old enough to be embarrassed by it. Even then, he'd wait at the corner where she couldn't see him, making sure she got there safe. That's who Michael was. That's what his absence took from the world. At 34, Michael lived in the same house where they'd grown up, the one their parents had left to both of them when they passed. Rita had married young, moved to her husband's place across town, and Michael stayed in the family home, keeping the lawn mowed the way their father had liked it, maintaining the garden their mother had planted. He worked construction, solid and steady, moved up to foreman because people trusted him. He didn't have a wife, didn't have kids of his own, but he had Rita's 2 boys, and he loved them fierce and gentle in equal measure. Every Saturday, without fail, Michael would pick up Rita's oldest son, 7-year-old Danny, and they'd go fishing at Ashley Lake. Michael was teaching him everything, not just how to cast a line or clean a fish, but how to be quiet with another person, how to appreciate the early morning mist on water, how to be patient with the world. Danny lived for those Saturdays, for the feeling of being chosen, of being worth Michael's undivided attention. The tackle box Michael kept was a thing of beauty if you understood what it meant. Every lure in its place, every hook sorted by size, every line coiled perfectly. He'd label everything in his block print: base lures, trout tackle, emergency kit. Danny loved opening that box, loved the order of it, the way it promised that if you were careful and prepared, you could handle whatever came. Michael was teaching him that too, though Danny was too young to know it then. August 15th, 1987. The Lake County Fair came to town like it did every summer, bringing the smell of funnel cakes and the sounds of carnival games and the kind of easy joy that small towns hold on to. Michael went with his crew from work, a bunch of guys getting beers and trying their luck at the ring toss, laughing at how they couldn't win the giant stuffed bears, but their kids sure wanted them. It was a good night, the kind of night that becomes precious later, because it was so ordinary, so perfectly normal. Michael left around 10:30. He told his buddy Frank he was heading home. Work came early on Monday, and he wanted to get some sleep. They shook hands in the parking lot, dust kicking up in the summer heat, even though the sun had been down for hours. Frank watched Michael walk to his truck, that old blue Ford he kept running through sheer determination and duct tape. That was the last time anyone who loved Michael Torres saw him alive. When Michael didn't show up for work Monday morning, his crew knew immediately something was catastrophically wrong. Michael didn't miss work, didn't even call in sick unless he was genuinely dying. Danny, the foreman who'd taken over when Michael got promoted, called the house. No answer. Called again. Nothing. By lunch, Danny was driving to Michael's place, a knot of worry in his stomach that kept getting tighter. The house was quiet. Michael's truck wasn't there. The door was locked. Everything looked normal, which somehow made everything feel worse. Danny called Rita, trying to keep his voice calm, trying not to scare her when he was already scared himself. Rita called the police. The police, in that way they have in the first hours when someone's missing, tried to be reassuring. He's an adult. Probably stayed with a friend. Give it 24 hours. Rita knew better. She knew her brother. She knew he wouldn't disappear without a word. Knew he wouldn't miss Saturday with Danny. Knew something was terribly, horribly wrong. She drove to his house and let herself in with the spare key he'd given her. Everything was exactly as Michael would leave it. Bed made, dishes done, his fishing vest hanging by the back door, tackle box underneath it. The only thing missing was Michael himself. The investigation started the way these things do in small towns. Everyone helps because everyone knows everyone, and when someone vanishes, the absence is felt by the whole community like a missing tooth, the tongue constantly finding the empty space. Volunteers searched the woods around town. Divers checked Ashley Lake, the place Michael loved most. The sheriff's department interviewed everyone who'd been at the fair that night. They found nothing. Michael Torres had simply disappeared between the fairground parking lot and his home, a distance of maybe 8 miles. 8 miles that might as well have been 8 million. Rita fell apart in the way that women do when they're trying desperately to hold everything together. She had 2 little boys who needed their mother, needed her to be strong, needed her to promise them everything would be okay. So she packed their lunches and drove them to school and smiled when it was expected of her. And then she'd get home and sit in her car in the driveway and sob until her ribs hurt. Her husband held her at night while she shook with the kind of grief that has nowhere to go because there's no body, no funeral, no ritual to mark the ending of someone's life. Just absence, just not knowing. Danny, her oldest, stopped talking much. He'd sit at the window on Saturday mornings, waiting for Uncle Michael's truck that never came. Rita would find him there, this 7-year-old boy keeping vigil, and her heart would break all over again. How do you explain to a child that sometimes people just disappear? How do you help him understand when you don't understand it yourself? The weeks turned into months. The sheriff's department did what they could, but in 1987, the tools available were limited. No cell phone records to trace, no security cameras on every corner, no DNA databases, just witness statements and tire tracks and the desperate hope that someone, somewhere, had seen something that mattered. They checked Michael's bank account. No activity. They talked to his friends, his co-workers, old girlfriends, anyone who might have had a reason to hurt him. Nothing made sense. Michael Torres didn't have enemies. He was the guy who brought everyone coffee. He was the uncle who taught patient fishing lessons. He was the son who maintained his parents' garden. Where did men like that disappear to? Rita organized search parties every weekend for the first 6 months. Dozens of people would show up, people who'd known Michael, people who'd just heard about it and wanted to help. They'd walk the woods in lines, calling his name, looking for any sign. They never found anything. It was like the earth had opened up and swallowed him whole. Rita would come home from these searches exhausted, hollowed out, covered in scratches from the brush, and she'd hang Michael's fishing vest back by her door like a talisman, like if she kept it there, he'd come back for it. The community rallied. That's what small towns do. They held a candlelight vigil 6 months after Michael vanished. Hundreds of people showed up, holding candles against the November wind, standing together in the darkness. They stood in the park near the lake where Michael had taught Danny to fish, and one by one, people spoke about who Michael had been. His kindness, his patience, his terrible jokes at construction sites that were never actually funny, but made everyone laugh anyway, because Michael's delivery was so earnestly bad. They cried together. They promised they wouldn't forget. They lit candles and watched them flicker and told themselves this meant something, that love could push back against the darkness of not knowing. Among them stood Robert Chen, the county's deputy sheriff, holding his candle with steady hands. Robert had moved to Kalispell 5 years earlier from Seattle, looking for the kind of quiet life he thought might fix what the big city had broken in him. He'd liked Michael, had met him a few times at the diner downtown, had appreciated the way Michael had welcomed him to town without making it a big thing. Standing there in the candlelight, watching Rita's face as people spoke about her brother, Robert made a promise he didn't tell anyone about. He wouldn't let this case go cold. He wouldn't let Michael Torres become just another name in an unsolved file. He owed the town that much. He owed Rita that much. Maybe he owed himself that much too. But cases go cold anyway, no matter what promises are made. By 1989, the active investigation had essentially ended. The file was still open, technically, but there were no new leads, no new information, no reason to believe they'd ever find Michael Torres. Rita called the sheriff's department every few months, always polite, always hopeful, always left with nothing. The detective assigned to the case, an older man named Patterson, who was kind but overwhelmed, would tell her the same thing each time. We haven't forgotten. We're still looking. Call if you hear anything. The script became familiar, wore grooves in both of them, this ritual of hope maintained against all odds. Rita's life moved forward, because life does that, even when part of your heart is frozen in August 1987. Her boys grew up. Danny eventually learned to tie fishing knots from his father, though they never felt quite right, never felt like the way Uncle Michael had taught them. He went to college, became an engineer, had kids of his own, but he never went fishing. Couldn't. The tackle box sat in Rita's attic, perfectly organized, waiting for someone who would never come back. Rita's younger son, Marcus, was too young to remember Michael clearly, which somehow felt like another loss. He knew his uncle only through stories, through photographs, through the weight of absence that shaped his family. He watched his mother hang that fishing vest by the door every time they moved houses, watched her keep those pockets filled with Michael's things like they were holy relics. He understood his family was built around a missing piece, a space where someone should be. Robert Chen stayed in the sheriff's department, eventually made detective, and every few years he'd pull out Michael Torres's file. He'd read through it again, hoping something new would jump out, some connection he'd missed. He'd call Rita, let her know he was still thinking about her brother, still hoping. These calls meant more to Rita than Robert probably knew. In a world where everyone else had moved on, had forgotten, here was someone who remembered. Here was someone who still cared. The years accumulated. 1990, 1995, 2000. Danny got married. Marcus graduated high school. Rita's hair went gray. The fishing vest faded in the sunlight from her back window. Michael's construction crew, the guys he'd brought coffee to, scattered to other jobs, other towns, other lives. Frank, his buddy from the fair that last night, moved to Missoula, took his memories with him. The world kept spinning. Only Rita stayed still, frozen in the moment between her brother leaving the fair and never coming home. She dreamed about him sometimes. In the dreams, Michael would be sitting at her kitchen table, older now, gray at the temples, and he'd smile at her like he used to. She'd want to ask him where he'd been, why he left, but in the dream, she could never speak. She'd wake up crying, her husband's arm around her, and she'd lie there in the dark thinking about all the Saturday mornings Michael had missed, all the coffee he'd never brought, all the fishing trips Danny had taken without him. In 2008, Rita turned 60. At her birthday party, surrounded by her grown sons and their families, she made a wish that everyone knew and nobody spoke. They'd been making the same wish for 21 years. Bring Michael home. Let us know. Give us an ending. Her grandson, Danny's oldest boy, was 7, the same age Danny had been when Michael disappeared. Rita watched him blow out the candles on her cake and felt the weight of generational loss, how trauma passes down, how this little boy would grow up with stories about a great uncle who vanished, how absence becomes inheritance. Robert Chen retired from the sheriff's department in 2015. He was 63, had put in his years, had earned his rest. But he couldn't leave Michael's case behind. He took copies of the files home with him. His wife, patient and understanding in the way spouses of obsessed detectives learn to be, set up a small office in their spare room. Robert would spend his retirement mornings there, going through everything again, making new connections, following leads that went nowhere. His wife would bring him coffee and kiss the top of his head and worry about him, about the way some cases burrow into your heart and never leave. Robert's obsession with Michael's case was rooted in something deeper than professional dedication. He'd moved to Kalispell in 1982 to escape the aftermath of his own brother's death. James Chen had been killed in a drive-by shooting in Seattle, a case of wrong place, wrong time, a life ended for no reason at all. James had been 23, full of promise, planning to go to medical school. The case was never solved. The detectives had tried. Robert knew they'd tried, but the leads had gone cold, and eventually the file had been archived, and James became just another unsolved murder in a city full of them. Robert had been a patrol officer in Seattle then. He'd watched his parents fall apart, watched his mother stop eating, watched his father age a decade in a year. He'd seen what it did to a family to have no answers, no closure, no justice. He'd promised himself then that if he ever had the chance, he'd be the detective who brought someone's loved one home, who gave a family the answers his own family had never gotten. When Michael Torres disappeared 5 years later, Robert saw his chance. This was a small town. The resources were limited, but so were the complications. If Michael was going to be found, Robert could be the one to find him. So he made that promise at the candlelight vigil, not out loud, not to anyone but himself. He'd find Michael Torres. He'd give Rita what his own mother had never gotten. He'd make someone's loss bearable in the way his brother's loss had never been. For 38 years, Robert carried both losses, his brother's and Michael's. They twined together in his mind, became inseparable. Every time he reopened Michael's file, he thought about James. Every time he called Rita to check in, he thought about his mother, about how she'd died without answers, about the way that had destroyed her slowly from the inside. When the DNA match finally came in 2023, when he got the call that Michael had been found, Robert called his father in Seattle before he called anyone else. His father was 91, living in a nursing home, his memory fading, but his grief still sharp. "Dad," Robert said, his voice shaking, "I found him. I found the missing man, the one I've been looking for all these years. I brought him home." His father was quiet on the other end of the line. Then, "James?" "No, Dad, not James, but someone's James. Someone's brother. I brought him home." His father cried then. This old man who'd lost his son 41 years ago and never recovered. "You're a good boy, Robert," he said. "You're a good boy. Your mother would be proud." Robert sat in his car in the sheriff's department parking lot and sobbed. This weight he'd been carrying for decades finally cracking open. He hadn't saved James. He couldn't save James. But he'd saved Michael, in a way. He'd brought him home. He'd given Rita what his mother never got. That had to count for something. That had to mean something. The break came in 2023, 36 years after Michael Torres walked out of the Lake County Fairgrounds and into nothing. It came from a place Robert had never expected, a case that seemed totally unrelated. A construction project in rural Flathead County, about 40 miles north of Kalispell, unearthed human remains. The bones were old, decades old, buried in a shallow grave in woods that had seen almost no human traffic. The remains were male, estimated age 30 to 40, estimated time of death mid to late 1980s. The county medical examiner, a thorough woman named Dr. Sarah Patel, extracted DNA from the bones and submitted it to the national database. It was routine, the kind of thing they did with all unidentified remains, hoping for a match to a missing person report. What came back made her sit down hard in her office chair and reach for the phone. The DNA matched Michael Torres. After 36 years, Michael had been found. He'd been 40 miles away this whole time, buried in woods that searchers had never thought to check, hidden in a place that made no sense given where he'd last been seen. Dr. Patel called the current sheriff, a younger woman who'd been in high school when Michael disappeared. The sheriff called Robert Chen because even retired, even officially out of the picture, Robert was the one who'd never let go. Robert was in his garden when his phone rang. He was planting tomatoes, his hands in the dirt, thinking about nothing more complicated than proper spacing and stakes. He saw the sheriff's number and knew, the way you know sometimes, that this call was different. He answered, and she said Michael Torres's name, and Robert sat down right there in his garden, dirt on his knees, and cried. He cried for Michael. He cried for Rita and her 36 years of not knowing. He cried for the promise he'd made at that candlelight vigil so long ago, the promise he'd kept even when it seemed futile. The sheriff asked if Robert wanted to be there when they told the family. Robert said yes. This was his to carry through to the end. They went to Rita's house on a Tuesday afternoon. Rita was 75 now, living alone since her husband had passed 2 years earlier. She still kept Michael's fishing vest by her back door. When she opened the door and saw the sheriff and Robert Chen standing there, she knew. She'd been waiting for this moment for 36 years, and somehow, she still wasn't ready. They sat at her kitchen table. Rita offered coffee out of habit. Her hands shook as she poured it. Robert took her hand and told her they'd found Michael. She'd imagined this moment so many times, had rehearsed her reaction, thought she'd be relieved or devastated or something simple. Instead, she felt everything at once. Relief that he'd been found, horror at what it meant, grief that was fresh again after years of going stale, and underneath it all, a strange peace. Michael was coming home. Not the way she'd hoped, not alive and apologetic and full of explanations, but home nonetheless. She asked the question mothers and sisters have asked in this moment forever. Did he suffer? Robert was honest because Rita deserved that, deserved truth after so many years of questions. They didn't know yet. The investigation was just beginning, but they'd find answers. He promised her that. Rita called her sons. Danny drove down from Missoula, where he lived now, made it in 2 hours, even though it should have taken 3. Marcus came from Helena. They sat together in their childhood home, these grown men and their aging mother, and held each other the way they hadn't since Danny was 7 and Marcus was 4, and Uncle Michael had just disappeared. They cried together. They looked at old photos. They remembered the coffee orders and the fishing knots and the terrible jokes. They mourned not just Michael, but the 36 years they'd spent mourning him, the way grief had shaped their lives, the weight they'd carried. The investigation that followed was meticulous and modern, using tools that hadn't existed in 1987. Dr. Patel examined the remains thoroughly. The bones showed evidence of blunt force trauma to the skull. Michael had been killed, struck from behind, death probably quick. That was something, Rita thought. Not much, but something. He hadn't suffered long. She held on to that fact like a life raft in the days that followed, this small mercy in a sea of horror. The forensic anthropology team worked carefully, documenting everything. The grave was shallow, hastily dug, the kind of burial done in panic rather than plan. Michael had been laid on his side, still wearing the clothes he'd worn to the fair. His wallet was still in his pocket, $53 inside, untouched. This wasn't a robbery. This wasn't random violence. This was personal. Dr. Patel called Rita 3 days after the initial identification, asked if she could come to the medical examiner's office. Rita went with Danny, her hands shaking as they drove. Dr. Patel was gentle, professional, but honest. She showed them what she'd found. The trauma pattern suggested a single blow, struck from behind while Michael was turned away. He hadn't seen it coming, hadn't had time to be afraid. Dr. Patel thought he'd died instantly, or close enough to make no difference. Rita asked if she could see him, see what was left. Dr. Patel explained gently that there wasn't much to see, just bones and fragments, 36 years of decomposition. But she showed Rita photographs of items recovered from the grave. Michael's watch, the one their father had given him, his belt buckle, a St. Christopher medal their mother had given him for protection. Rita broke down seeing these things, these small pieces of her brother that had survived when he hadn't. The DNA that solved the case came from an unexpected source. Forensic genealogy, the same technique that had caught the Golden State Killer and dozens of other cold cases, proved Michael's identity. But it did something else too. When technicians processed the gravesite, they found trace evidence, fabric fibers, paint chips, and caught in the fabric, protected by the soil, was DNA that didn't belong to Michael. The forensic team was thorough. They mapped the entire gravesite, sifted the soil, collected every piece of evidence. There were fragments of blue fabric, consistent with the work shirt Michael had been wearing. There were paint chips, automotive paint, the kind used on trucks in the 1980s. There were soil samples that matched the surrounding area. And there, caught in the fibers of Michael's shirt collar, preserved by chance and the specific chemistry of the soil, were skin cells that didn't belong to the victim. The lab extracted DNA from those cells. It was degraded, partial, but enough. They ran it through CODIS, the FBI's DNA database. No match. The killer had never been arrested, never had their DNA collected. But forensic genealogy had opened new doors. The lab uploaded the DNA profile to GEDmatch, one of the public genealogy databases where people voluntarily submit their genetic information, hoping to find long-lost relatives or learn about their ancestry. The database found partial matches, second cousins, third cousins, people who shared enough DNA with the unknown profile to suggest family connections. From there, it was detective work. A genetic genealogist named Amanda Price, working with law enforcement, began building family trees. She worked backwards from the matches, identifying common ancestors, mapping out descendants, following the branches until she found someone who fit the profile. Male, right age, living in Montana in 1987. The DNA went into the databases. It pinged on a genealogy site, one of those services where people send in their spit, hoping to find out they're part Italian or descended from royalty. The lab built a family tree. The tree led to a family in Kalispell. The tree led to someone who'd been there in 1987. The tree led to someone who'd been at that candlelight vigil, holding a candle, mourning with everyone else. The tree led to Frank Morrison, Michael Torres's best friend from work, the last person to see him alive at the county fair. When Robert Chen saw the name, he went cold. He remembered Frank, remembered him from the initial investigation, the witness statement he'd given, the tears he'd cried talking about his missing friend, remembered him at the vigil, standing with Michael's crew, all of them holding candles, all of them promising to remember. Frank Morrison had helped search the woods. Frank Morrison had brought casseroles to Rita's house. Frank Morrison had held Danny on his shoulders at Michael's memorial service, this little boy who'd lost his uncle, and told him Uncle Michael was watching over him from heaven. Frank Morrison had killed Michael Torres and buried him in the woods, and then spent 36 years pretending to mourn him. The why came out slowly, piece by piece, the way these things do. Frank Morrison had been having an affair with Michael's girlfriend, a woman named Jennifer who worked at the hospital. Michael had found out the day of the fair. There'd been a confrontation after the fairgrounds, when Frank followed Michael, supposedly to explain, supposedly to apologize. It had escalated. Michael had turned away, disgusted, done with Frank forever. And Frank, in that moment, had made a choice that destroyed multiple lives. He'd hit Michael with a tire iron from his truck. One blow. That's all it took. Then he'd panicked, loaded Michael's body in his truck, driven to woods he knew from hunting, and buried his best friend in a shallow grave. Then he'd gone home, showered, slept, woke up Monday and acted surprised when Michael didn't show up to work. The arrest happened on a Thursday morning. Frank was 71 now, retired, living in the same house he'd lived in for 40 years, 3 blocks from where Rita raised her sons. He'd been there the whole time, going to the grocery store, mowing his lawn, attending the same church. He'd watched Rita grow old with grief. He'd attended her husband's funeral. He'd sent a card when Danny graduated college. He'd been a ghost at every Torres family event, present in absence, the friend who'd mourned right alongside them. When the police knocked on his door, Frank opened it calmly. He looked at the officers, at the detective behind them, and his face did something complicated. Not surprise exactly, something closer to resignation. "It's about Michael," he said. Not a question, a statement. They read him his rights on his front porch while neighbors watched from behind curtains. Frank didn't resist, didn't argue, didn't ask for a lawyer. He just stood there, this old man in khaki pants and a cardigan, and let them put handcuffs on his wrists. As they walked him to the car, he looked back at his house, at the lawn he'd mowed every Saturday for 40 years, at the life he'd built on top of murder, and said quietly, "I've been waiting for this for 36 years." At the station, Frank waived his right to a lawyer immediately. He wanted to talk, needed to talk, had been carrying this for so long that the weight had become unbearable. He told them everything: the affair with Jennifer, the confrontation at the fair, following Michael's truck, flagging him down on a deserted road, trying to explain, trying to apologize. Michael's disgust, his refusal to even discuss it. "You're not worth my time, Frank. Stay away from me. Stay away from Jennifer. We're done." Michael had turned to get back in his truck, and Frank, in that moment, had seen red, had grabbed the tire iron from his own truck bed, had swung it without thinking, had watched his best friend fall, had panicked, had made a choice that would define the rest of his life. "I knew Rita would be waiting for him," Frank said to the detectives, crying now, this old man with decades of guilt pooling in his eyes. "I knew Danny would be waiting for their fishing trip. I knew everyone who loved him would be waiting. And I went home, and I slept, and I woke up, and I acted surprised. I spent 36 years acting surprised." The detective interviewing him, a younger man named Martinez, who'd been in elementary school when Michael disappeared, had to take a break. He stepped out of the interview room, stood in the hallway, tried to process the magnitude of Frank's betrayal. Not just the murder, but the decades of deception. The vigils attended, the searches participated in, the casseroles brought to a grieving family, the systematic, sustained cruelty of pretending to care while knowing exactly what had happened. When Robert Chen heard about the confession, he drove to the station immediately. He watched the interview through the one-way glass, this detective who'd spent 36 years searching for answers, and he felt something break loose in his chest. Relief, rage, grief, vindication. It was over. After all these years, it was finally over. He'd kept his promise. He'd brought Michael home. He'd given Rita answers. The trial took place in the spring of 2024. Rita attended every day, sitting in the front row with Danny and Marcus on either side of her, holding her hands. She'd worried she'd fall apart, that seeing Frank would break something in her that couldn't be fixed. Instead, she felt cold and clear and certain. This was necessary. This was justice, imperfect and late, but still meaningful. The prosecution called witness after witness. Jennifer, Michael's old girlfriend, now 63 and living in Oregon, came back to testify. She'd left Montana after Michael disappeared, couldn't bear to stay in a place where everything reminded her of him. She'd never known about Frank's involvement, had mourned Michael authentically, had carried guilt about their affair for decades. Learning that Frank had killed Michael, that the man she'd cheated with had murdered the man she'd loved, broke something in her. She testified through tears, her voice shaking, telling the jury about the affair, about how Michael had found out, about the last conversation she'd had with him, where he'd told her he couldn't forgive her. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But that he'd loved her, and that had to count for something. "He deserved better than me," Jennifer told the jury. "He deserved better than what either of us gave him." And Frank took away any chance Michael had to move on, to find someone who'd treat him right, to have the life he should have had. The defense attorney, a public defender named Sarah Kim, who'd drawn the short straw of defending the indefensible, tried to humanize Frank. She called his wife, Patricia, who'd been married to him for 43 years. Patricia was a small woman, aged by shock and grief, her hands trembling as she took the stand. She'd had no idea. 43 years married to a murderer, and she'd had no idea. She testified that Frank was a good husband, a good father, a good grandfather, that he'd coached Little League and volunteered at the church and never missed his grandchildren's school plays. "I don't know who my husband is," Patricia said, crying. "I thought I knew him. I thought I knew everything about him. But I was married to a stranger. I was married to someone who could kill his best friend and then tuck our children into bed and tell them bedtime stories. I don't know what that makes me. I don't know what that makes our life together." Rita watched Patricia testify and felt an unexpected stab of compassion. Patricia was a victim too, in her way. Her life had been built on a lie. Her marriage, her family, everything she thought she knew was contaminated by Frank's crime. Rita found herself wondering how you survive that, how you reconcile loving someone with learning they're capable of murder. She didn't hate Patricia. She couldn't. Patricia had lost everything too. Frank's children testified for the defense, 3 adults in their 40s who looked shell-shocked and broken. They talked about their father, the man who'd taught them to ride bikes and helped with homework and walked them down the aisle at their weddings. They didn't deny what he'd done. They couldn't. But they begged the jury to see him as human, as more than just his worst act. "My father destroyed the Torres family," Frank's daughter Amanda said, sobbing. "But he destroyed ours too. We grew up 3 blocks from Danny and Marcus. We played together as kids. My father's crime has taken our family from us as surely as it took Michael from his. We lost our father too. We just didn't know it for 36 years. The jury listened to all of it. The evidence, the confession, the testimonies, the defense's attempts to mitigate, the prosecution's insistence that 36 years of lies showed consciousness of guilt, showed a man who'd made a choice every single day to protect himself at the cost of a family's peace. Frank's defense tried to paint it as an accident, a fight that got out of hand, a moment of passion and panic. But the prosecution had the shallow grave, the 36 years of lies, the systematic deception. Frank had attended Michael's memorial service. He'd comforted Rita. He'd helped search for a man he knew was dead, a man he'd killed. That showed consciousness of guilt. That showed a choice made over and over for 36 years. During closing arguments, the prosecutor, a woman named Rachel Diaz, who'd been moved by Rita's strength, spoke directly to the jury about what Frank had stolen. "He didn't just kill Michael Torres," she said. "He killed Rita's peace. He killed Danny's childhood. He killed Marcus's ability to remember his uncle clearly. He killed 36 years of the Torres family's life, and he did it while pretending to mourn alongside them. That's not manslaughter. That's not a moment of passion. That's sustained cruelty over decades." The jury deliberated for 3 hours, guilty of second-degree murder. Rita felt Danny squeeze her hand. She felt the tears on her face. She felt relief and rage and grief and something like peace, all tangled together into an emotion she didn't have words for. At sentencing, the judge allowed victim impact statements. Rita stood, 75 years old, carrying 36 years of waiting, and spoke about her brother. She didn't talk about his death. She talked about his life, about the coffee orders, about teaching Danny to fish, about the garden he'd maintained and the way he'd walked her to school, and the thousands of small kindnesses that made Michael Torres who he was. She talked about the hole his absence had carved in their family, how 3 generations had grown up in the shadow of not knowing. She talked about Saturday mornings and fishing vests and tackle boxes organized with love. Then she looked at Frank Morrison, This old man who'd stood beside her at vigils and memorials, and she said, "You didn't just kill my brother. You killed our peace. You killed our ability to grieve properly. You killed 36 years of our lives. And you did it while pretending to mourn with us. That's a cruelty I don't have words for." The judge sentenced Frank Morrison to 20 years in prison. He was 71. He'd likely die there. Rita felt no satisfaction in that. Justice, she was learning, doesn't heal. It just provides a framework for grief, gives it boundaries and official recognition. The hole in her life didn't close because Frank was in prison. Michael was still dead. The 36 years were still gone. But at least now she knew. At least now there was a grave she could visit, a place to bring flowers, a stone with Michael's name and the dates that bracketed his life, 1953, 1987. After the trial, Robert Chen came to Rita's house. They sat on her back porch, the same porch where Michael had taught Danny to tie fishing knots. Robert brought the original case file, everything he'd kept all these years. He gave it to Rita, said she should have it, should know that someone had never forgotten, had never stopped looking. Rita held the thick folder and cried. She cried for Michael and for herself and for Robert Chen, this detective who'd kept a promise for 36 years. She cried for Danny, who'd learned to fish from his father but never enjoyed it. She cried for Marcus, who'd grown up with a ghost uncle. She cried for all of them, the living left behind. "Thank you," she told Robert. "Thank you for not forgetting him." Robert, this man who'd spent his career and his retirement carrying other people's losses, cried too. "He deserved to be found," he said. "You deserve to know." They sat together in the late afternoon sun, two old people who'd been connected by tragedy and determination, and talked about Michael Torres, not about his death, not about the case, but about who he'd been, the good memories, the love that persisted despite everything, the way absence shapes us, but doesn't have to define us. Michael Torres was buried in the town cemetery 3 months after the trial, in a plot next to his parents. The funeral was huge, the whole town turning out. People who'd never known Michael coming to pay respects to the man who'd finally come home. Rita buried him with his fishing vest, couldn't bear to keep it anymore, needed him to have it. She kept the tackle box, though. Couldn't let that go. It sat in her living room now, no longer hidden in the attic. This beautiful thing her brother had made, every lure still in place. Danny brought his son, who was 12 now, to the funeral. After it was over, after everyone had left, and it was just family standing around Michael's fresh grave, Danny pulled out the tackle box. His hands shook as he opened it, showed his son the organization, the labels in his great-uncle's block print. "Your great-uncle Michael was going to teach me to fish," Danny told his son. "He taught me a lot of things, but he never got to finish. I never learned the final knot, the one that's supposed to be the strongest. But I learned enough. I learned that being patient matters. I learned that small kindnesses matter. I learned that showing up for people matters." His son looked at the tackle box, touched the lures carefully, reverently. "Can you teach me?" he asked. Danny thought about it. Thought about Saturday mornings and uncles and generational loss and healing and the way we carry our dead with us, whether we want to or not. "Yeah," he said. "Yeah, I can teach you." That summer, Danny took his son fishing at Ashley Lake. It was hard. It brought up feelings he'd spent 40 years trying to ignore. But he did it anyway, because that's what Michael would have wanted, would have expected. He taught his son the knots he remembered. They didn't catch much. They didn't need to. Being there was enough. Being together was enough. Remembering was enough. Rita lived 3 more years after they buried Michael. She died peacefully in her sleep at 78, and her sons like to think she spent those final years lighter somehow, unburdened by not knowing. She'd visit Michael's grave every week, bring fresh flowers, sit on the bench nearby and tell him about her week. It was a ritual that brought her comfort, this ability to finally place her grief somewhere specific, somewhere real. Those final 3 years were different. There was still grief, still loss, still the ache of Michael's absence. But there was also something like peace. Rita could finally sleep through the night without waking at 3 a.m. wondering if Michael was cold, was scared, was alone. She knew now. He'd died quickly. He hadn't suffered long. He'd been found. He'd been brought home. These weren't small things. They were everything. She became closer to Patricia Morrison in those years, something neither of them had expected. They'd meet for coffee sometimes, these 2 old women whose lives had been destroyed by the same man in different ways. They didn't talk about Frank. They talked about their grandchildren, about their gardens, about the small pleasures of being alive. They found comfort in each other, this understanding that they'd both survived something unsurvivable, that they were both still here, still finding reasons to get up in the morning. "I'm sorry," Patricia told Rita once, over coffee at the diner downtown. "I know it doesn't mean anything, but I'm sorry. I was married to him. I should have known. I should have seen something." Rita took Patricia's hand, these 2 old women with liver-spotted skin and trembling fingers. "You couldn't have known," she said. "None of us knew. That's what makes it so terrible. He was so good at pretending to be human." Rita's grandchildren remember those final years as good ones. She'd tell them stories about Michael, happy stories now, not sad ones, about the fishing trips and the coffee orders and the garden he'd maintained. She'd show them the tackle box, let them touch the lures, explain how each one was meant for different fish, different conditions. She'd teach them patience, the way Michael had taught Danny. She'd make them feel connected to an uncle they'd never met, make them understand they were part of something larger than themselves, part of a family that endured, that loved fiercely, that didn't forget. Danny's oldest grandchild, a girl named Michelle, spent a lot of time with Rita in those final years. She was 16, thoughtful and quiet, the kind of teenager who actually wanted to spend time with her great-grandmother. Michelle would come over on Saturday mornings, help Rita with the garden, listen to stories about Michael. She'd never known him, but through Rita's stories, she felt like she had. "Do you think you've forgiven Frank?" Michelle asked once, while they were planting tomatoes, their hands in the earth. Rita was quiet for a long time, thinking. "I don't think forgiveness is the point," she finally said. "Forgiveness is for when someone is sorry and wants to be better. Frank is sorry now because he got caught, not because he felt guilty. What I have is acceptance. I accept that this happened. I accept that I can't change it. I accept that justice came late, but it came. That's not forgiveness. That's survival." Michelle thought about that, these wise words from her great-grandmother who'd carried loss for 40 years and was still here, still planting tomatoes, still finding reasons to nurture growing things. "You're the strongest person I know," Michelle told her. Rita smiled, her eyes crinkling. "I'm not strong, honey. I just kept going because stopping wasn't an option. That's not strength. That's just stubbornness." She paused, looked at the tomato plants they were settling into the soil, but maybe stubbornness is enough. Maybe just refusing to give up is its own kind of victory. At her funeral, Danny told the story about the coffee orders, about how Michael had remembered everyone, had seen people, had made them feel valued. "That's what we lost," Danny said. "Not just my uncle, but the thousands of small kindnesses he would have done if he'd lived. That's what murder takes. It doesn't just take one life. It takes all the lives that life would have touched." The church was packed. Rita had lived in Kalispell her entire life, had touched countless people through her quiet strength, her refusal to give up, her determination to honor her brother's memory. People came from all over Montana, people who'd known Michael, people who'd only known Rita, people who'd followed the case in the news and felt connected to this family's long journey toward justice. One by one, people stood to share their memories. Michael's old construction crew, the ones still alive, now in their 70s and 80s, talked about his leadership, his kindness, the way he'd made every person on the site feel essential. A woman named Margaret stood up, introducing herself as someone who'd been in high school with Michael. She told a story about how Michael had defended her from bullies, how he'd walked her home when some boys were bothering her, how he'd made her feel safe in a world that hadn't always been kind. "I'm 69 years old now," she said, crying. "And I still remember that Michael Torres made me feel like I mattered. That's who we lost. That's who Frank Morrison took from us." Danny's daughter spoke, Rita's granddaughter, a woman in her 40s who'd heard stories about Michael her entire life. "I never met my great-uncle Michael," she said, "but he shaped my life anyway. My grandmother's love for him, her refusal to forget him, taught me what family means, taught me that we don't abandon people just because they're gone, taught me that love persists." She spent 41 years mourning her brother, but she also spent 41 years celebrating him, making sure we all knew who he was, what he meant. That's not just grief, that's devotion. That's the kind of love that changes the world, one small kindness at a time. Marcus spoke too, this man who'd grown up in the shadow of his brother's grief, who'd never really known Michael but had been shaped by his absence anyway. "I spent my whole life hearing about someone I couldn't remember," he said. "It took me a long time to understand that he shaped me too, even though I never knew him. The way my family loved him, the way they refused to forget him, taught me what loyalty means, what family means, what love means even when it hurts." He paused, looked at his brother Danny, at his own children sitting in the front pew, at the community that had gathered to mourn his mother. "My mom taught us that absence doesn't erase love, that not having answers doesn't mean you stop asking questions, that justice delayed is still justice, still matters, still has the power to heal. She taught us that you can carry grief and still find joy, that you can miss someone desperately and still build a good life. That loss doesn't define you unless you let it." Marcus's voice broke. She got to bury her brother before she died. She got to know what happened to him. She got to see justice done. That's not nothing. That's everything. And it only happened because she never gave up. Because she called the sheriff's department every 6 months for 36 years. Because she kept Michael's story alive. Because she refused to let him be forgotten. The pastor who'd known Rita for 50 years spoke about her faith, about how she'd struggled with it after Michael disappeared, how she'd been angry at God for years, how she'd slowly found her way back, not to certainty, but to hope. Rita didn't have easy answers, the pastor said. She didn't believe in cheap comfort or simple explanations, but she believed in persistence. She believed in love. She believed that morning comes, even after the longest night. That's the gift she gave us. The example of enduring, of surviving, of loving fiercely, even when it hurts. Robert Chen came to Rita's funeral. He was 82 now, moving slowly. But he came. He stood with the Torres family and mourned the woman who'd trusted him, who'd believed in him, who'd waited 36 years because he'd promised her he wouldn't forget. After the service, Danny approached him, shook his hand, held it. "Thank you," Danny said, "for everything, for keeping your promise, for bringing my uncle home." Robert nodded, this old detective who'd carried so many people's losses. "I'm sorry it took so long," he said. "But you did it," Danny said. "That's what matters. You did it." They stood together for a moment, this old detective and the nephew who'd learned to fish too late, and shared the weight of everything that had happened. The waiting, the searching, the finding, the justice, the peace that came, imperfect and incomplete, but real. "Your mother was remarkable," Robert said. "In all my years in law enforcement, I never met anyone with her strength. She carried that loss for 40 years, and it never made her bitter, never made her hard. She stayed kind. She stayed hopeful. That's rare." Danny thought about his mother, about the woman who'd packed his lunches and held him when he cried and kept his uncle's fishing vest by the door like a prayer. "She was just stubborn," he said, smiling through tears. "She was too stubborn to give up." "Stubbornness is underrated," Robert said. "Sometimes it's stubbornness that saves us. Sometimes refusing to quit is the bravest thing we can do." The community's response to Rita's death was overwhelming. The local newspaper ran a full-page obituary, calling her a symbol of endurance, a testament to a mother's love, a reminder that families never stop searching for their missing. The mayor issued a proclamation declaring Rita Torres Day in Kalispell, honoring her memory and her refusal to let her brother be forgotten. The high school named a scholarship after her, the Rita Torres Memorial Award, given annually to a student who demonstrated extraordinary resilience in the face of adversity. But perhaps the most meaningful tribute came from the Sheriff's Department. They created the Rita Torres Cold Case Initiative, dedicating resources specifically to unsolved missing persons cases from the 1970s and 1980s. They hired genealogists, invested in new technology, committed to applying modern techniques to old mysteries. The message was clear. We don't forget. We don't give up. Every missing person matters. Every family deserves answers. At the initiative's launch, the current sheriff, a woman named Maria Rodriguez, who'd been inspired by Rita's story, spoke to a crowd gathered at the courthouse. "Rita Torres showed us what love looks like in its purest form," Sheriff Rodriguez said. "She showed us that giving up is not an option when someone you love is missing. She showed us that families don't move on, they move forward, carrying their missing with them every step. This initiative is our promise to honor her example. No more families waiting 40 years. No more cold cases forgotten in archives. Every missing person will have someone fighting for them, someone refusing to let them disappear into statistics." The initiative's first success came 18 months after Rita's death. They solved a 1979 case, a young woman named Catherine Mills, who disappeared from Billings. Using the same forensic genealogy techniques that had identified Michael's killer, they traced DNA from Catherine's remains to a long-dead serial offender. Catherine's sister, now 73, wept when she got the call. "Thank God for Rita Torres," she said. "Thank God someone showed us this was possible." Word of the initiative spread. Other states took notice, started their own programs. Montana became a model for how to handle cold cases, how to use new technology ethically and effectively, how to center families in the process. And every program, in every state, acknowledged Rita Torres as the inspiration, the woman who'd waited and hoped and refused to forget. Danny and Marcus established the Michael Torres Scholarship Fund at the community college, supporting students studying criminal justice or forensic science. They wanted Michael's legacy to be about creating more Robert Chens, more investigators who cared deeply, who made promises and kept them, who understood that behind every case file was a family still waiting. The scholarship's motto became, "Remember, persist, bring them home." The first recipient was a young woman named Sarah, 21 years old, whose own uncle had disappeared when she was a child. She'd grown up watching her aunt grieve, watching her family fracture under the weight of not knowing. She'd decided to become a detective specifically to help families like hers, like the Torres family, like all the families who wait and hope and need someone to care. Robert went home that night and took Michael Torres's file out of his office for the last time. He'd kept copies even after the case closed, couldn't quite let go. But now Rita was gone. Michael was gone. The case was solved. It was time. He put the file in a box, wrote, "Solved, Michael Torres, 1987-2023" on the outside, and put it in storage. Not thrown away. He could never throw it away. But put away, finally, at rest. Years passed. Danny's son grew up. He became a teacher, married a kind woman, had kids of his own. He taught them all how to fish, passing down the knots his father had learned from a great uncle who died before any of them were born. On Saturday mornings sometimes, he'd take them to Ashley Lake, and while they fished, he'd tell them about Michael Torres, about the coffee orders, about the patience, about the kind of man worth remembering. Michael's story became part of the family mythology, the way stories do. The tragedy softened over generations, became less about murder and more about love, about a family that never gave up, about an uncle who'd mattered so much that his absence was felt for decades. The pain transformed slowly into something else, not exactly healing, but a kind of integration, the way broken bones knit together, stronger at the break. In Kalispell, Montana, there's a bench at Ashley Lake with a small plaque. It was installed by Danny and Marcus 5 years after Michael was found. The plaque reads, "In memory of Michael Torres, 1953-1987. He taught us patience, kindness, and how to tie the strongest knots." Fishermen use that bench all the time, have no idea whose memory they're sitting with. But sometimes, on Saturday mornings, when the mist is on the water and the light is just right, you might see an older man sitting there, tackle box at his feet, and you'd swear he's waiting for someone. This is what remains after everything else falls away. Love. The stubborn, persistent, unreasonable love that refuses to forget, that carries the missing forward, that tells their stories, that insists they mattered. Michael Torres mattered. His life mattered. His death mattered. The 36 years his family waited mattered. The detective who wouldn't give up mattered. The justice, imperfect and late, mattered. We are, all of us, the sum of the people we've loved and lost. We are shaped by absence as much as presence, by the spaces where someone should be, by the memories we maintain against the erosion of time. Rita Torres lived 78 years, and for 46 of them, she was defined by her brother's disappearance. That's not tragic. That's love. That's what love looks like when it has nowhere to go but inward, when it has to sustain itself on hope and memory, and the stubborn refusal to forget. Danny Torres is 67 now. His hair is gray. His hands are weathered from years of engineering work, strong and capable, the kind of hands that can build things, fix things, make things right. He keeps Michael's tackle box in his study, shows it to his grandchildren when they visit. They don't understand its significance, not really, but they will someday. They'll grow up hearing the stories, learning the knots, understanding that family is as much about the absent as the present, that we carry our dead with us in the careful ways we live, in the kindnesses we extend, in the memories we refuse to let die. Marcus is 63, still living in Helena, still close to his brother despite the distance. They talk every week, these two men who grew up in the shadow of an uncle's disappearance. They share memories their mother told them, stories about Michael that have been polished smooth by repetition, precious as river stones. They visit Michael's grave together once a year, on August 15th, the anniversary of the day he disappeared. They don't stay long, just long enough to remember, to mark the date, to acknowledge that Michael Torres lived and mattered, and is still, in his way, present. Robert Chen died in 2028, peacefully, surrounded by his family. At his funeral, his wife told stories about his obsession with unsolved cases, about the way he couldn't let go, couldn't rest while families waited. She talked about Michael Torres specifically, about the promise Robert had made at a candlelight vigil in 1987, about the decades he'd spent keeping that promise. He was a good man, she said, crying, proud. He gave families peace. He brought people home. Danny and Marcus attended Robert's funeral. They stood in the back, these two older men who'd once been boys waiting for an uncle who never came home, and they mourned the detective who'd finally brought him back. After the service, they approached Robert's widow, introduced themselves. "We're the Torres brothers," Danny said. "Robert brought our uncle home." Robert's wife took their hands, held them tight. "I know who you are," she said. "Robert talked about your family until the day he died. Your uncle mattered to him. You all did." They stood together, these people connected by tragedy and resolution and the long arc of justice, and they cried for Robert Chen, for Michael Torres, for all the years of waiting and searching and hoping. They cried for the healing that had finally come, imperfect and incomplete, but real. This is how we survive loss, not by forgetting, but by remembering, not by moving on, but by moving forward, carrying our dead with us, letting them shape us, learning from their absence, how to appreciate presence. Michael Torres taught his nephew to fish in the mornings before work. He brought his construction crew coffee every Monday. He maintained his parents' garden. He was patient and kind and remembered what mattered to people. These aren't huge things. They're not dramatic or extraordinary. They're just human, just good, just the kind of small, persistent kindnesses that make the world bearable. And that's what was lost when Michael Torres was murdered in August 1987. Not just one life, but all the coffee orders he would have remembered, all the fishing lessons he would have taught, all the flowers he would have planted, all the small ways he would have made the world slightly better, slightly kinder, slightly more bearable. That's what murder takes. That's what Frank Morrison stole when he hit his friend with a tire iron and buried him in the woods and then pretended to mourn. But here's what murder doesn't take: the memory of who someone was, the impact they had, the love they generated. Michael Torres has been dead for 37 years now. Most people who knew him are dead too. His construction crew, his buddies from the fair, his neighbors, all gone or scattered or too old to remember clearly. But his story persists. His family persists. The bench at Ashley Lake persists. The tackle box, carefully organized, persists. And every Saturday morning, somewhere in Montana, a great-grandson who never knew Michael Torres takes his own kids fishing. He teaches them the knots his grandfather taught him, the knots his great-great-uncle taught his grandfather. He's patient with them when they struggle. He brings them to the water early, shows them how to be quiet together, how to appreciate the morning. He doesn't think consciously about Michael Torres while he does this, but Michael is there anyway, in the patience, in the kindness, in the careful way love passes down through generations, in the stubborn insistence that people matter, that absence teaches as much as presence, that we honor our dead by living the way they would have wanted. This is what remains. This is what endures. Not the murder, not the 36 years of waiting, not even the justice that finally came. What endures is love. Stubborn, persistent, unreasonable love that refuses to forget, that carries forward, that transforms grief into memory, memory into story, story into legacy. Michael Torres died in 1987, but in the ways that matter most, he's still here, still teaching patience, still showing kindness, still remembering what matters. That's not closure. There's no such thing as closure when you lose someone to murder. But it's something. It's the understanding that we are all connected, that every life touches countless others, that love doesn't end when life does. It's the knowledge that families survive what seems unsurvivable, that investigators keep promises even when it takes decades, that justice matters even when it comes late, even when it can't undo what was done. The sun sets over Ashley Lake every evening, painting the water gold and pink and purple. Fishermen pack up their gear. Families head home for dinner. The bench with Michael Torres's name sits quiet and still, bearing witness, and somewhere, always, someone is learning to tie a fishing knot, patient hands guiding smaller ones, passing down not just a skill, but a philosophy, not just a technique, but a way of being in the world. Careful, patient, kind, present. Michael Torres would have liked that, would have recognized himself in it, in the passing down of small things that matter, in the attention paid to details, in the belief that showing up for people counts, that small kindnesses accumulate into a life worth living, worth remembering, worth carrying forward. So we remember. We tell the stories. We teach the knots. We maintain the gardens. We bring the coffee. We show up again and again for the people we love and the people we've lost, refusing to let absence be the final word, insisting that love persists, that meaning endures, that even the smallest life casts a long shadow, that everyone matters, that everyone deserves to be found, to be known, to be mourned properly, to be carried forward into the future by people who refuse to forget. This is the story of Michael Torres. This is the story of his sister Rita, who waited 36 years and never stopped hoping. This is the story of Detective Robert Chen, who made a promise at a candlelight vigil and kept it until the day he died. This is the story of Danny and Marcus, who grew up in the shadow of loss and became men who understood the value of persistence and love. This is the story of all of us, really. Everyone who's ever loved someone. Everyone who's ever lost someone. Everyone who's ever had to figure out how to keep living when part of your heart is permanently elsewhere. We endure. We remember. We love anyway, despite everything, because of everything. We carry our dead with us, let them shape us, learn from them even in their absence. And sometimes, on Saturday mornings when the light is right, we take our children to the water and teach them what we know, pass down what was passed to us, keep the chain unbroken, patient, kind, present. These are the knots that hold us together. These are the ties that bind us. This is how we survive. This is how we honor those we've lost. This is how love persists even when life doesn't. Michael Torres, 1953-1987. He mattered. He still matters. He will always matter. That's what his family taught us. That's what his story means. That absence is a presence too. That love doesn't end. That we're all connected by the people we carry with us, the stories we tell, the memories we refuse to let fade. That justice matters, even when it comes late. That patience is a virtue, and kindness is a practice, and remembering is an act of defiance against the erasure of time. This is how we carry our dead. This is how they live on. Not in grand gestures or monuments, but in fishing knots and coffee orders and flower gardens. In the small, persistent acts of love that accumulate into a life, into a family, into a story worth telling. Michael Torres is gone, but Michael Torres is still here. In every Saturday morning, in every patient lesson, in every act of kindness, still here, still teaching, still mattering, always.